afternoon. Anyway, we're going to talk a little bit about gas exchange. Gas exchange is another practical example of water potential, diffusion gradients, equilibrium, passive active transport. It's all involved in the world of gas exchange. Let's just clarify that we know what we're talking about first. Gas exchange, what am I talking about? What am I exchanging? A little more specific than gas, please. Oh, I don't need everybody at once. All right. Miss Smith, what am I exchanging? Which for which? Right. So, depends on where you are in the body would be a better answer. But in general, we are taking in oxygen and we are getting rid of carbon dioxide. And that's what we mean by gas exchange. Why do we need the oxygen? We need it to, what process needs oxygen? Cellular respiration, which is the conversion of glucose into ATP. Without oxygen, you can't do that. If you didn't have to convert glucose to ATP, rip your lungs out, get rid of gas exchange, you don't need it. The whole reason you breathe, the whole reason you breathe, the whole reason you have a set of lungs, the whole reason we take in oxygen is simply to convert glucose to ATP. Other than that, oxygen's a pain in the butt. It's a poison, toxic gas. You can't get much more reactive than oxygen. It wants 2 electrons, and it's not polite about it. It'll beat you to a pulp to get those 2 electrons. Free oxygen is very damaging. It's so damaging we don't even let it in our body and leave it alone. As soon as it comes in, we do what with it? As soon as that oxygen comes out of the lung into the bloodstream, what grabs it? Which blood cell? Red blood cells grab onto it immediately because free oxygen can be very damaging. We just like to take advantage of that and let it rip our sugars apart for us so we can produce ATP. CO2 for us is useless. We can't photosynthesize. All CO2 does is get converted into carbonic acid and cause massive changes in our pH, which is not good because it could denature our proteins. Oh my gosh, I just connected 3 different things. Dang, I hate when that happens. Nothing's supposed to connect in school. It's all supposed to be isolated and stuff I can just forget. Just useless facts that they make us jump through some hoops so we can get a piece of paper. Keeps us out of our parents' hair for a few years. Yeah? All right. So, I'm not going to go through every one of these pictures. I'm going to pick a few that I think, again, traditionally students have had a harder time grasping. The first one is one really clever solution by Mother Nature again. This is an example we call counter current exchange. We're going to use fish gills in this case because this is how fish exchange gases. We don't use counter current exchange for gas exchange. But we're going to see this weekend, as humans, we use counter current exchange for waste removal. So the concepts I'm about to describe that fish use in breathing, we use the same strategy for producing urine and filtering the blood. With me? So, of course, fish live in water. Surprise. Okay. And they breathe through gills. And they can get away with gills, and we can't because it's one of the big evolutionary hurdles. They live in water, we don't. So what's the problem if we have gills on land? So what would happen to them? What would their gills literally do? Dry up. Respiratory membranes. Any respiratory membrane needs to be what? moist. You require moisture for gas exchange. They also need to be thin, and they also need to have direct contact with the circulatory system. Moist, thin, and contact with the circulatory system. Well, if you try to go out on land with a set of gills, moisture is out the window. Those things are going to dry up pretty darn quick, and you're going to be totally dysfunctional. It is only when, through evolutionary mechanisms, that we developed a way to move our respiratory membranes inside our body to prevent them from drying out, that we were able to successfully move to land. Yeah? Right? Another key thing about any good respiratory surface, connecting back, oh my gosh, now we're going to connect to an activity we did. Connecting back to the agar cubes. Here's the gills blown up. They're broken into gill filaments. What in the heck is the point of making gill filaments? Thank you. They increase surface area and reduce volume. Because we should know from the exercise, and you were playing around a little bit, that if you want to improve diffusion, you have to manipulate those two variables. Volume needs to go down and surface area needs to go up. So I don't have a gill that looks like this, one big flat piece of tissue, because that's got very large volume and very small surface area ratio. That would stinkola. Not work. Instead, I have these gill filaments with very small volume, extremely high surface area. Yeah? Your own lungs. How do we do something similar? We got, yeah, is the lung one big sac? No. The lung is divided into millions of little tiny air sacs called alveoli, right? Which are connected to tree-like branches of the bronchial tubes, yes. If this was one big bag, you would have the same problem. Large volume, small surface area. Instead, we have millions of little tiny bags which have small volume and huge surface area. Yeah? So, moist membrane, thin membranes, high surface area to volume ratio, direct contact with the blood supply. All really, really critical. Now, this is called a countercurrent exchange. When fish breathe, normally the water, as you can see, goes through the mouth and it comes back out through the gills, and that's what passes the water over. This is why fish are continually swimming and moving. In rivers, most fish will orientate themselves so that they face upstream, so the current comes across the gills. Okay? Depending on where you're at. So, let me jump ahead. I'm going to a blank slide for those at home watching the little pictures go forward and backward, and try to make some sense of this. Let me show you what doesn't happen first, because I think it makes more sense that way. So, there's two ways I could make this work. Water could come in, and it could go in the same direction that the blood is flowing. Or water can come in and it can go in the opposite direction that the blood is flowing. This is what we call counter current exchange, because the currents are flowing counter to each other or opposite each other. We're going to see this is preferable, a counter current exchange. But I'm going to show you why having parallel circuits doesn't work. Yeah? So when we are breathing in water, what am I breathing? Dissolved oxygen. Is that the oxygen that made up the water? We are not splitting water and producing oxygen. Right? This is atmospheric oxygen that has been mixed into the water. It's dissolved oxygen. All right. Concentration-wise, how does that compare to the atmosphere? It's going to be less. There's a much lower concentration of atmospheric oxygen in the water than in the atmosphere. All right. So the fish start at a disadvantage because they're living in an environment where oxygen is much less available. All right. So whatever that happens to be, so water comes in at full saturation of oxygen, the most it can carry, which is less than the atmosphere. Yes? And blood is going to start out, blood will start out high or low in oxygen. Low. It's already circulated around the body. It's already been used. Yes? It's coming from the heart to the gills. It is deoxygenated blood. All right? So at this point, we've got a gradient of 100 versus 20. Which way does the oxygen want to move?
To the blood.
Wants to move to the blood. Is that a problem?
I'm not sure.
Do we want oxygen going into the fish's blood?
Yeah.
I would hope so. Okay. We certainly don't want it going the other way. Well, but look what happens. So say that goes to 100, that goes then to 75, that then goes to 25, that goes to 10, that goes to 0. Okay? Don't ask me why I skipped 50. Let me actually, don't know why I even care. Well, similar ideas happening here. So 100 oxygen's moving in, that number's got to go where? Up. So maybe that jumps up to 40. Which way is the oxygen now moving? Still going into the blood. All right. Now that's going to go up. Which way is the oxygen going to want to move? Wait, who did that? Son of a turkey. In this case, the oxygen wants to go back into the water. Is that something we want to happen? No. What happens if they run parallel is about halfway through the process, the gradient's going to flip. And you're going to actually end up moving materials opposite of what you want to do. You're actually heading towards equilibrium, and then you're going to go past equilibrium. Am I making some sense? That doesn't work. You're only going to get, by the time you got all the way through, you really haven't done anything. So by going counter current exchange, okay, water would have come in, right, so this would have been the lead end of the water down here, correct? So we got 100 here, right? And this would have been the lead end of the blood down here, which would be about 20. Got me? Here's where the blood's coming in at the lowest point. Here's where the water's coming in at its highest point. Following me? So they're entering at opposite ends now, not at the same end. Water's coming in at the highest at this end. Blood's coming in at the opposite end at the lowest. Yes? So as we progress, if it's working correctly, the oxygen level should be doing what as they go? Should be decreasing. And if all's going well, these should be increasing. So what's happening is that's still meeting the needs. That's still gradient, gradient, gradient all the way down is favoring the movement of oxygen into the blood. So when water is almost depleted of its oxygen, it's meeting blood where it's almost at its lowest tune, so the gradient still favors the water. When the water is at its highest, it's meeting the blood near its highest, but still at a gradient where it favors the movement out of water. So you have exchange of oxygen across the entire length of the system, not just the first half of the system. Does that make any sense at all? This is what's called counter current exchange. It's all about keeping the gradient in your favor. You are preventing yourself from ever reaching equilibrium, or worse, reversing the gradient, where then now things are moving in a direction that don't favor you. Yes or no? Yes, ma'am.
I don't know if it's completely unrelated, but when I read this last night, I was kind of confused because the blood is moving against, like, isn't it supposed to move from high concentration of oxygen to low concentration? Is that kind of like this going on?
I'm not sure what you're saying.
There was something in reading about.
Okay, so this is a basic diagram of the human respiratory system. I am going to bypass this one in class because I think this is something generally students pick up on pretty easily. By all means, if you don't pick up on it over this evening, we can certainly come back and talk about it. All right? But it's pretty much a basic anatomy phys diagram. So I want to relate to this one here. This is about inhaling and exhaling. And it starts to get into what Claire brought up about with pressure. This again relates to passive transport. For the most part, passive transport. Only in this case, we're not going to be using a concentration gradient. We're going to be using a pressure gradient. There are three primary forces that cause diffusion: concentration gradients, pressure gradients, and temperature gradients. This one is primarily based on pressure. Primarily based on pressure. All right? So, first of all, let's clear up any myths that may still be out there. Your lungs, two of them, reside in your thoracic chest cavity. Like everything else in your body, it's double wrapped. It's got a visceral pleural membrane which tightly adheres around the lungs. And then there is the parietal pleural membrane which lines the actual cavity, creating a little gap space which fills with fluid called the pleural fluid. All right? And that helps lubricate the lungs and all that good stuff. Can you picture this? Do you have any clue what I'm talking about? Everything in your body is double wrapped and fluid in between. One thing that lungs don't have that most people think they do have is what? What type of tissue do you not find in lungs that you might think they would have? Do not find muscle tissue in a lung. There is no muscle in a lung. I think some people still picture the lungs as these big bellows that can, on their own, expand and contract. This big muscle is just exhale, inhale, exhale, inhale. Okay. What? Oh, they'll be fine. So you can't do that. I mean, to actually actively pump air in and out of your body with a muscle, holy energy-sucking process. All right? It wouldn't work. You couldn't provide energy fast enough to do that, because this is something you're doing from the day you were born to the day you die, and it doesn't stop. Yeah? Some of you look confused that you don't stop breathing. Yes, when you're sleeping, you still breathe. So, instead, we use external muscles outside the lung, to help create pressure variances, pressure differences. All right? And that's a little bit more efficient use of energy, because we're going to do a little bit of muscle movement, which is going to create a pressure gradient, which is going to allow most of the air to move for absolutely no energy whatsoever. So there are two primary muscles that are going to do this. There's a big muscle that goes across here, which separates your thoracic from your abdominal cavity. This is called the diaphragm. Big flat muscle. All right? A lot of cases, if you like those beef fajitas, that's what you're eating. Okay? And then there is muscles in the rib cage. There are actual muscles between the ribs called intercostal muscles. These are the ones you like to slap barbecue sauce on and suck on them with your teeth. And, well, not, you don't suck with your teeth, but gnaw them with your teeth. Okay? And so there are intercostal muscles between the rib cage, and there is this big diaphragm. When you are in a relaxed state, here is a relaxed state. For those at home, that's this one. Relaxed state. The rib cage, the muscles are relaxed, so the rib cage sits low. And the diaphragm actually pops up into like a bell shape, as you can see in the diagram here. So here is the rib cage, the arrows are pointing down, it sits low, and you have more of this bell-shaped curve to the diaphragm. That's a relaxed state. Well, when the rib cage is down and the diaphragm's up, what happens to the volume of the chest? Does the volume of the chest increase or decrease? Decrease. And then the relationship between volume and pressure is what? If volume decreases, pressure should increase because they're inversely proportional. Okay? And then when you go into a contracted state, an active state, when the diaphragm contracts, it flattens. And the rib cage is lifted. So what did I just do to the volume of the chest cavity? Increased it, which would cause the pressure to decrease. Now what I'm changing the pressure in relationship is to the atmospheric pressure. I'm changing my pressure in relationship to the atmospheric pressure. So if I want to inhale, this is what the first picture is representing, is inhalation, the one I checked with the green arrow. So if I want to inhale, it takes a little energy to contract the muscles. Diaphragm goes down, rib cage goes up. Volume has increased, pressure therefore in the lungs has decreased lower than atmospheric pressure. Since it's lower than atmospheric pressure, air is going to want to naturally move in. Air is going to naturally move from high pressure in the atmosphere to low pressure in the lungs. Going anywhere? And that costs me a little bit of energy to contract those muscles to do that. When I'm ready to exhale, all I have to do is let my muscles relax, which costs me nothing. When my muscles relax, my diaphragm pops up, my rib cage drops, and I just cause the volume of the chest cavity to decrease, which caused the pressure to increase greater than atmospheric pressure. Thus, air will go out. And that's all just basically taking advantage of creating a pressure gradient. So, 90% of the air movement, give or take a few percent, 90% of the air movement is essentially free. It's only a little investment in contracting that diaphragm and those rib muscles. And so if you haven't exercised in a while and you go out and you start trying to exercise, one of the first areas that gives you a pain is usually right through here. And we might think that's our stomach, but that is usually our diaphragm, which is now being actively used much more so than it was being used. Yes? Okay. Yeah? That's everybody saying they have a stomach ache. It's not a stomach ache, it's an intestinal ache. Your stomach's right here. Yeah. It sits up this high. This is not your stomach. This is your stomach. Here's your heart. Your stomach sits right below.
Difference in the gradient smaller when you go out west.
Yes. So, Buddy jumped slightly ahead of me, which is fine, no problem. But I was going to say, what happens when you go, say, out to Colorado? You're at a higher altitude. So what's happened to the pressure up there?
High.
Less pressure. All right? So the difference in pressure between your lungs and the air is going to be smaller, which is going to make it easier or harder to move air in and out. Harder. So if you're not used to that area and you haven't adjusted to that area, when you go out there and you try to say run, it's much more difficult, much more work, because you're not getting as efficient gas exchange as you do at your own natural elevation. Now, if you're out there for a while and you train out there, you can do things to increase hemoglobin in the blood and all that type of stuff, and you can adapt to that. So they always said the Denver Broncos used to have a big advantage playing at the old Mile High Stadium because it was at a very high altitude, and all the visiting teams, they always would argue, were at a disadvantage. Yeah. It's actually an acid that got up into your esophagus, and it's burning the esophagus, but your esophagus runs right behind your heart. So here's the stomach pushing acid up into the esophagus, and the burning sensation is near the heart, so it feels like your heart is burning. Okay. It's really just acid reflux into the esophagus. Yes. Because if you put water in the lungs, gases can't exchange efficiently. Standing water prevents gas exchange. Yeah. So as fluid builds up in your lungs just simply can't exchange gases. You literally are suffocating or drowning internally. Absolutely. If you get enough water in the lungs, you can suffocate, die. Yes. I don't know. Liquid oxygen in your lungs? I can't imagine that would be good. But I don't know. Well, where nitrogen becomes an issue is not when you increase elevation. And in what situations do you tend to decrease if you're doing what activity? Scuba diving. And you're going down, because as you go down in the ocean, what happens to pressure? Increases. And this can cause the issues with nitrogen and oxygen, and that's why sometimes if you got to know what you're doing and go through decompression, any clue what I'm talking about? Okay. Otherwise, you can get this excess nitrogen. You can get this excess nitrogen buildup, which can be very dangerous. Anything there? Once, twice. All right. I'm not going to go through this one right now. Again, one I think you can sort of figure out yourself. The last two get into more specific gas exchange. So inhale, exhale, that's a pretty basic gas exchange. Now we're going to get it down to the cellular level in the questions 6 and 7, or questions 6 and 8. We're going to get it down into the cellular level. Okay? There are basically two major sites of exchange, and that's what these different pictures are representing. The first site of exchange in gas exchange is between what and what? If we're doing oxygen, let's do oxygen exchange first. Where's the first point of exchange? From the lungs to the capillaries. From the lungs to the capillaries. All right, that's the first site of exchange. Once it's entered the capillaries, it's now in the transport system, the circulatory system, where it will now be transported to the second site of exchange, where it moves from the capillaries into whatever, the cells that need it. Could be muscle cells, could be all types of different types of cells. So that's what these diagrams are going to start trying to represent, is the movement of materials in and out of the two exchange sites. So it says the following diagram discuss how concentration gradients of pressure are involved in the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide between the alveoli and lungs, the capillaries of the system, and the cells of the body. So this one is dealing with the pickup of oxygen at the lungs and the drop-off of carbon dioxide. When you go to this one, this is now at the cellular level, and what's happening at the cellular level, the second site of exchange. Yes? Okay. So in the lungs, we need to have, what has to be the concentration gradient for this to work in terms of oxygen?
It has to be less where you want it to go.
It has to be less than where you want it to go. All right. So there has to be more inside the lungs. So we got to have a higher concentration of oxygen. And don't write this down on yours because I'm not going to do it the way the book does it. So you got to have high oxygen here and low oxygen here, which is not what goes in that diagram. I'm just doing it my own way. Okay. Yes? Does that make some sense? All right. If that's the case, then using the gradient, we would expect oxygen to go into the blood, following the arrow. Almost immediately, as soon as that oxygen is put into the blood, what happens to it again? Remember, it's a poisonous gas.
Oh, the hemoglobin.
The hemoglobin, the red blood cells, are going to grab it right away. Again, this is not how they labeled it. But as soon as the oxygen comes in, the red blood cells grab it, and they do what with it? They take it away, which keeps the gradient of oxygen in the blood very low, which keeps you from reaching equilibrium, which continues to allow oxygen to continually flow in from the lungs. Following me? Because once oxygen is bound to hemoglobin, it's no longer free oxygen. It's not affecting the gradient. It's not affecting the gradient. Yes? There's another factor here, which is pressure. Right? By changing the pressure, you can make the hemoglobin either more receptive or less receptive to the oxygen. So at the lungs, you're going to create a pressure gradient, which makes hemoglobin more likely to pick up oxygen. When it gets to the cells, that changes. You create a pressure gradient, which really favors hemoglobin releasing the oxygen. This is a pretty strong bond. It's a pretty darn strong bond between hemoglobin and oxygen. So if I've got the right pressure, I'm grabbing this guy, and I'm grabbing him really tight because I'm not letting him get loose in the body and wreak havoc. I'm like, you come with me, buddy. We're going over here to the muscle cell, which needs you. Bet you stay here. All right? By the time we get over here, the pressure's off. And we then just let him go. Yay. Same thing idea is going to happen with carbon dioxide. I relax for a minute. Now they send me some carbon dioxide. Ah! Got you. Let's go over here. Okay? And then release you. I mean, that's a real simplified explanation. But so there's two factors going on, both the concentration gradient and the pressure gradient. What the pressure gradient does is favor the affinity chemical attraction between hemoglobin and oxygen. It also favors the reaction of either converting carbon dioxide into carbonic acid or converting carbonic acid back into carbon dioxide. Going anywhere? All right. And I'm going to let you sort of work out the details of that as you work through the homework this evening.